So to start with, we're going to discuss the implementation of long intervals. So generally, those long intervals involve 3 to 5 repetitions of 800 to 1,000 meters, separated by 2 minutes of passive recovery. Most of the time, players are grouped depending on their fitness test results. Could be maximal aerobic speed or the speed reached into after a continuous linear type of test. We have groups of players reaching 16, 17, 18 or 19 km per hour, for example. Or if player had the chance to perform the 30-15 intermittent fitness test that we discussed in length during the first part of this lesson, we generally use more 18, 19, 20 and above 21 kilometers as reference to group the players. Most of the time, those long intervals are performed at the end of a session and more likely at the end of the day for different reasons. The main reason is that we know that when the muscles are fatigued, warmed up, but when they get a bit of fatigue, like at the end of the session, there is a greater slow component in terms of VO2 response. So what's the slow component is actually the fact that for the same amount of work, the muscle, because it's fatigued, tend to consume a bit more oxygen. And that just helps players to reach higher levels of oxygen uptake without having the need to have them running faster and creating more fatigue on the legs, for example. So it's a pretty strategic and there's a physiological purpose of doing those intervals when players are already a bit fatigued. So this overall approach, having those intervals at the end of the session, allow us to restrict a little bit the running speed. And if a player was to be fresh, he might be running at 18, but being a bit tired at the end of the session, he might get the same cardiovascular benefit while running at 17 only, which helps to decrease a little bit the amount of high intensity running, for example. This is very important to limit or control the overall high speed running load over the week. As we're going to discuss a lot throughout the next slides. Practically, depending on the pitch setup and the length of the pitch that varies a little bit between the location of facilities, but most of the time, a little bit like it's shown on the graph, it's possible to draw kind of a more or less 100-meter loop on the pitch. You can have cones, for example, on that example, every 75 meters, so that you can pace the players while whistling or just having a sound of speakers or whatsoever to help them to keep the pace as required. So again, that's probably specific to each location, but that's a little bit of an idea to give them the pace. We're going to talk now a bit more in details about the next weapon, so the short intervals, which is by far my favorite training format, the favorite weapon, and I still call it a bit like the Swiss knife in terms of the idea that we can tailor the physiological response very, very well, so that we can reach most of the physiological targets that we discussed in length in the first part. Especially, we can hit the type 1, 2, 3, 4 just by changing the way we design and we use the small intervals. So for this matter, it's clearly the most useful format, even though it might not be as fun and specific as the small-sided games, as we discuss further. But in terms of generic type of training, very, very useful tool in that sense. So the idea is that further than targeting each type of targets, the different types, in terms of modulating the neuromuscular load, it's as well very, very easy to design a HIIT training with more or less of high-speed running and or more or less neuromuscular load in terms of mechanical work, for example. So mechanical work that I refer to often, as a reminder, represents the acceleration, deceleration, change direction. So the work over small spaces. So by just adding a few turns, the amount of high-speed running will decrease, and conversely, the amount of acceleration and deceleration will increase. So it's very, very easy to tailor the type of neuromuscular demands of interval session with short intervals. So, for example, to be more specific, in pre-season, we would tend likely to decrease the amount of neuromuscular load, just to avoid the overall neuromuscular load that is already high because of the volume of training and the fact that players return to train. So if we could have those sessions more like type 1 or maybe type 3, which, if you remember, are those sessions with low neuromuscular load, that's probably easier for the start of the preseason. Conversely, during the season, for substitutes, for example, which are lacking the physiological stimuli from the games when they don't play, it might be important to target type 4 types of intervals, which involve the targeting of both actually aerobic, anaerobic, and high neuromuscular demands. So in that case, we will tend to increase the neuromuscular load of these sessions to compensate for the neuromuscular load that those substitutes might miss while not playing. And in that case, we might be using both short intervals and, as I was going to see after, small-sided games as well, since both those formats can be used to target the type 2 and the type 4, which involve a high neuromuscular load. I was about to forget as well the rehab players. For rehab players, the short intervals are probably the most useful as well, because again, those intervals can be designed at the start of the rehab process with very, very low neuromuscular demands, and as the confidence, the strength, and all the locomotor aspects improves in that in previously injured player, we can just increase progressively the load, the neuromuscular load of the sequences. So in practice, how do we implement those short intervals? As we discussed as well a lot in the first part, using the final speed reached at the 30-15 is pretty easy. We just then need to group the players again based on their fitness results. And in that example, we have 5 groups, for example, players that finish the test around 17, 18, 19, 20, or 21, or even more. And we just have to set up a starting line, some cones as target distances, and we just have them running through. Obviously, very generic type of conditioning, but that might be at some time interesting, and we're going to discuss further how to implement them a bit more specifically, or with a bit more emphasis on the specific football demands. That's about running straight line. It becomes a little bit more, not complex, but requires a little bit of reflection when we want to implement those drills with changes of direction. Because, for example, a lot of people will decide to include change of direction for 2 main reasons. First of all, adding change of direction, as we discussed before, decreases the amount of high-speed running, because if the distance is shorter, players will have time to reach higher speed, and they will have to decelerate and reaccelerate. So we decrease the amount of high speed and we increase the amount of mechanical work, which is the reason why we generally introduce change of direction. But then, because of the energy requirement of the changes of direction, we cannot ask players to perform the same distance. Like if a player, based on his 30-15 results, is required to run 80 meters during a straight line runs, we cannot ask him to run 80 meters over different shuttles. Like, for example, 40-40, or could be a different breakdown, but it just becomes impossible. Because if we had to run 40 and 40 within the same time as he's running 80, that will actually require him to run at a high intensity, because he had, in addition to the 80 meters, he would have to produce more work to turn, to brake, turn, and reaccelerate. So for that, I have produced a spreadsheet that is available on my website as well, upon request, that kind of estimates more roughly, but it's pretty useful at least, estimates the increased energetical demands of a turn, so that when we introduce shuttles, as in the graph, the overall distance is reduced as a function of the number of turns. So in that example, the players will be required to run 72 meters straight. But if we introduce one shuttle with one turn, we'll ask him to run only 65. So that's a drop by 7 meters overall, which is meant to compensate for the time he's going to lose and increase energy when he will have to turn. So in that example, but it's obviously depending on the speed and the number of turns, but in this example, we kind of withdraw, we take 7 meters out from the run because of the additional turn. And again, this is pretty simple to implement once you have the design spreadsheet or that you can develop on your own. So further than that, now we just discussed shuttles, we can go further into the types of angle. Shall we always use shuttle? Probably not. We can use probably sharper turns like 135 or kind of easier turn like 45 degrees. And as you can see on this slide as well, and you see in this video, there was measurements we were measuring back in the days in Aspire Academy in Qatar, where we had players, as we discussed in the part 1, measuring their gas analysis, measuring lactate, and a lot of different measures to assess the neuromuscular load of runs with different types of angles. And what we found is that, interestingly, there was kind of a U shape in terms of neuromuscular demands and overall physiological demands based on the type of angles. So straight lines are pretty demanding because of the high-speed component. And very sharp runs are also very sharp turns are pretty demanding as well because of the amount of mechanical work and the repeated acceleration, deceleration. But in the middle, when we use kind of slow turns like 45 degrees, are probably the best way to decrease the overall neuromuscular demands for the fact that with 45, players are obviously not required to perform a lot of mechanical work because it's kind of easy. But the small turns just make them to run a little bit slower. So that diminishes as well the amount of high intensity running. So with 45 degrees angle, you decrease on both sides, the high speed and the mechanical work, the neuromuscular demands. And that's why it's a very, very useful setup to use these 45 degree angles because it allows you to have runs with lower neuromuscular demands. So when we talk about implementing type 1 high intensity interval trainings, think about using 45 degree angles to decrease the overall neuromuscular demands. That's a pretty simple principle, but very, very useful in practice. To keep on with this reasoning and give you a little bit more context into something very applied, you can see here the 3 types of runs, straight lines, 45 or 135 with sharp angles, and how that relates in terms of GPS readings in players. So as you can see, more or less, the greater the angles, the lower total distance, because obviously, in this case, in 10 seconds, you don't do much distance if you do a lot of change of direction. So the overall distance cover over the intermittent series decrease with the angles, but that doesn't really matter to us in terms of total distance. What matters to us is, again, amount of high-speed running and amount of mechanical work. So straight line, we have 600 meters of high-speed running and almost no mechanical work. A little bit when players have to start. We have, in the middle, very low with the 45, low high-speed, low mechanical work. And when we go down with the last one, with the sharp angles, we have 0 high-speed running, obviously impossible to reach high-speed running, but we have obviously far much higher mechanical work. So as simple as that, you could see now how GPS have actually helped us to understand how modulating and using the different types of turns during runs could help us to actually impact the amount or selectively target different types of neuromuscular loading, high-speed running versus mechanical work. I've been talking essentially about generic type of running, but in practice, we very often introduce the ball during all those drills, just for the fact that it becomes obviously a bit more specific, but I'm not really keen on talking about specificity all the time, but it's more to make it's most of the time to make it just more appealing for players. So they just invest themselves and they just enjoy more some of these sequences which are sometimes a bit painful mentally. So adding the ball just makes everyone happier, and they get better motivation, and you get more benefit from it anyway. So having the ball, but just because they have the ball doesn't mean it's specific, because you can still have the ball and just dribbling in one corner. It doesn't mean it's specific. So if we really want to think specific a bit more, let's try to understand the position where the player is actually playing, and if we could try to replicate a bit more the patterns depending on the position as well, or the type of passes or sequences of passes that he might have to go through when he plays. So for example, as shown on this graph, you will have the example of, again, a 10-20 type of intervals for a fullback, and another one for a midfielder. And as you see, as you know, the fullback will be required to do way more high-intensity, high-speed running, while the midfielder will probably do a bit more mechanical work, because you will have just simply different movement on the pitch to get the ball, pass the ball, and eventually progress with the balls. So with some kind of position-specific movement patterns, we could still have different, very, very different readings in terms of GPS outputs. And in this case, as you can see, the midfielder in the end with this sequence over 3 minutes, he will end up by covering only 200 meters at high speed with a mechanical work of 9 units, while the fullback will actually cover more than 500 meters at high speed with a little bit lower mechanical work, and which is good with those differences, that those differences match the actual differences that we see during games. So implementing those kind of drills, we are kind of feeding or giving to the players the load that is actually related to the training demands, the playing demands, sorry. Now, what about the overall volume of high-speed running or mechanical work running throughout one session or the overall week? So I think, again, it's interesting to use the game as a kind of a target reference to have an idea of the volume that might be required. So if we think that depending on the position, depending on the player style or profile, most of players will be required to run between 600 up to almost 1300 or sometimes even more meters of high intensity during a game. So having that in mind, that would be kind of the game target. And then depending on that, whether players have played within the previous days or not, they might need to reproduce this load to kind of prepare them to the game demands. So for substitutes, for example, that's a good target in terms of volume. Obviously, we can think about that individually, but that's the idea. These are the game demands. The players hasn't played. That's what we can try to give him as targets. Same for players coming from rehab. We generally tend to build up the playing time when they start to play with the team, but we can have the same approach when we start to train them, and also give them initially the equivalent of 30 minutes, 45, an hour of game demands using those volume targets as well. Which is interesting is that when we think about those game targets, reaching 600 or 700 meters throughout high intensity generic type of running, or even with the ball, that doesn't require to spend or to perform very, very long sequences. Most of the time, in between 4 to 10 minutes of high intensity running, you get your game targets. And that's been pretty interesting to realize that getting the dose, the equivalent of a game, doesn't require much time, which is good for us as well, because that means that within short top-ups, often at the end of a session or during individualized sequence, we can kind of easily top up the players to match those game demands. And obviously, I will discuss a bit more further how we have the same approach, but using small-sided games in the next part.